Welcome. You're watching BloombergQuint. As September draws to an end, we're closing out a fortnight of intense diplomatic activity for India's foreign policy leadership. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has returned from a visit to the United States, where he held his first bilateral meeting with the US President Joe Biden. Then, along with Biden, Modi attended the first in person Quad summit at the White House, along with the leaders of Australia and Japan. These meetings come a month and a half after Afghanistan fell to the Taliban as the US pulled out its 20-year-long military presence there. Joining us to talk about the outcomes of these meetings is Ambassador Meera Shankar, who's led India's mission in the United States. Ambassador Shankar, thank you very much for making time. Let's start with asking you what you thought India's foreign policy priorities were going into these meetings. And as an outcome of these meetings, how much of those that has there been progress secured on, and how much has there been reassurance gotten?
Well, I think that this is a very historic meeting because it represents a coming together of countries who have concerns about China's assertive and sometimes even aggressive behavior in the Indo-Pacific. Now, for India, the concerns also extend to the South Asian land borders that we share with China. So this, I think, describes both the possibilities as well as the limits within which perhaps the Quad has taken its decisions. It's not a security alliance, that's what they've made clear, but it is going to bring countries which are like-minded and which share democratic values together to look at what they could do in other spheres to establish their presence in this region and act as a balancer to China. The three key takeaways, I would say, from the meeting were on the COVID pandemic, on critical technologies, which I would say was perhaps the most important. And the third is climate change. So on the COVID pandemic, we are seeing a collaborative effort to provide vaccines to the world. And this had got stalled or, stopped because of the problems that India had in terms of ramping up its vaccine production at a time when its own needs were very heavy. But now India feels that it is in a position to start exports. So here you have an Indian company, Biological E, which will produce Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccines for supply to the world. Japan will provide financing to countries to buy these vaccines. Australia will also provide financing for purchase of vaccines, but also provide logistics for transport of these vaccines. So it's kind of a quadrilateral collaborative effort.
On that specific point, isn't that the same framework that was agreed upon in March that's probably being executed now? So this vaccine push out is, and who will finance, who will make, who will do the logistics, or something that they spoke of in March. One question, you started for the first minute of what you were saying by anchoring this to China. The Quad in its language does not say that country's name, even once. Not in this joint statement, not in any communication or any gathering that's happened in any form since either the March digital meeting or before that. Now, why I ask you is this: if it is going so out of its way to talk about what it's not, that we're not an anti-China grouping, we're not a military grouping, and try and arrive at what is it for, and you laid down the three pillars. I'm asking whether those three pillars are indeed what there is collective cohesiveness on. And because I want to pick up the third on climate today, particularly, we've heard that Prime Minister Scott Morrison will not be going to the COP26 summit and will not be participating in a redoubling of what needs to happen after Paris 5 years ago or 6 years ago. To renew the pledge towards a more accelerated change in terms of fuel consumption because of Australia's legacy fossil fuel anchored economy. Now, so on climate, is there an equal buy-in? On America, for example, you'd have necessarily a pivot were there to be an election in 2024 and a diametrically different approach to climate between Democrats and Republicans. So I'm wondering whether in the three ideas of what this quad thinks it's for and about, is there continuity and runway to reach common goals on those fronts either?
Well, I think it's still a group in the making and a work in progress. And we have to see how it is able to deliver
Mhm.
on these three issues in future. It's difficult to come to a conclusion about how effective the grouping is going to be till you see whether it is actually able and how far it is able to operationalize some of the decisions that it has taken. So that is why I hold the COVID vaccine decision as critical, because it will lend weight to the credibility of the group, that they don't just make announcements, but they are actually delivering on what they have said. On critical technologies, it's a coming together of countries to provide, again, alternatives to Chinese technology in the field of telecommunications, 5G and beyond, in the field of semiconductors, in other fields also, where you will see they have talked of resilient and diversified supply chains and how they are going to contribute to this. So you have the possibility of 5G networks built on open RAN, and then each country can build around that instead of closed networks. These are things which are still to be thrashed out, fleshed out, but and they will probably have to bring in other countries in such cooperation as required. That flexibility should be there because they talk of it also as being inclusive. So, for instance, on semiconductors, Taiwan and South Korea, I think, would be critical because they are the key producers of semiconductors. But the designing is done in India and of most of the chips. And so this is an interesting, very interesting possibilities of collaboration on critical technologies. And they
That
have talked of setting standards as well. I think this is going to be the most important decision if they are able to operationalize it. And then on your question on climate change, if you see the joint statement, it's a general, the country is committed to
1.5
contributing towards net zero, carbon neutrality, preferably by 2050, and taking into account national circumstances. So it's a kind of hedged commitment, but it's an inclusion where it's a statement to which both India and Australia have subscribed. And both Australia and India, Australia, because so much of its economy is dependent on resources, including coal, and India, because it is a developing country which sees that it might have to keep open the development option and without raising costs. I think there are specific positions that these countries have. But certainly from India's point of view, we have a very ambitious renewable energy goal of 450 gigawatts. And we also have sectoral pledges that we are looking at, for instance, to decarbonize the railways, which is very achievable because if you electrify the railway network, it also brings down your cost of operation, it makes it less polluting, and it's climate friendly.
we
So
heard on that last front, have we heard anything from the Japanese government and its agencies in the progress that they'd like to see on that? Because, for example, JICA has been involved in some of these marquee projects on the railway transformation that India is attempting right now for the last 8-10 years. And there has been some time and cost overrun and slippage. So, do we know if those partners, Japan's a partner is in India's railway transformation, that those partners are happy with the way that is progressing?
well, I would have hope that it could move faster. because it's the key to turning around the railways as well. There's an economic logic and there's a climate logic, there's an efficiency logic. So given all this, actually that should have been the first task that the railways undertook, to actually electrify their entire network. And I think it's the fact that the goal has been adopted, and now that there is a conscious decision of the government to progress towards this, I think is progress, because for so long the railways have depended on coal or on diesel, and these are not going to be fuels of the future, and that has actually made them suffer losses as well economically.
On the bilateral front, there is one line of argument about how, since this is a new US administration that's 8 months into office, whether this is an administration that's finding its feet with how to align and how to position and the tone to set with multiple countries. On the other hand, I was listening to something Ashley Tellis was saying in the lead up to these meetings, and he pointed out how at the point in that crucial week in Afghanistan where things went very very bad, you did not hear any part of the Indian state make a critical observation about the American handling of that pullout. And therefore, while this might be a new American administration from the Indian foreign policy team, it was very clear how it was handling what was being seen as President Biden's most public global policy moment at that time. So, on the bilateral front, I'm asking on security, counterterrorism priorities, and on commerce, has there been progress in what could be seen as a way one administration in America operates, and the handling and the glide path to the next, as this one is the government has the government been able to keep its priorities intact from one administration to the next?
I think we must remember that there's a broad bipartisan consensus in the US across Republicans and Democratic administrations to build the relationship with India. In fact, when I was there in the US in the 1990s as Minister of Commerce, I recall reading Nixon's biography, and Nixon was our most trenchant critic during 1971, if you recall. And in his biography, he says that the big competition is going to be in future is going to be between two Asian giants, India and China. And I hope that in this process we side with democratic India. And that was Nixon. So this is an issue on which there is consensus across administrations. I think what India has to avoid is becoming partisan in US domestic politics without the capacity to impact that politics. So I think we have to make it very clear that, we work with whoever is the US administration. And if you look back on Afghanistan, then, Biden was more or less presented with a fait accompli, because Trump had done the deal with the Taliban.
Specific exit date and specific.
And that deal did not, it was basically a cover for providing safe passage for American troops out of Afghanistan. It did not hold the Taliban to a ceasefire. It did not hold them to recognition of the Afghan government or to dialogue with the Afghan government. It did not hold them to lay down arms as part of a peace process, and it did not hold them to actually concluding a political negotiation on the future setup of Afghanistan. And by the time Biden came, all US soldiers had virtually been withdrawn by Trump. There were 2,500 US troops left in Afghanistan. So actually, I would say that India did not criticize Trump's deal either. In fact, I think we were there at the signing. So having taken that position, I think it would have been, very inconsistent to criticize Biden's withdrawal.
I don't think the withdrawal. It was I don't think the manner
of the withdrawal.
Yes,
the manner in which it was done was, very, very chaotic. And the fact that the Taliban's entry into Kabul virtually blindsided everybody who were looking at a much longer period of transition, for the Taliban to take over, whereas they walked in and Ghani left.
Hmm.
So I think that, this is something on which we have concerns.
On how do they
And
look forward?
what we want the US to do is not to give a free ride to Pakistan on fostering terrorism. Now
That's what I
that
was going to
we
ask. So
have
how
withdrawn
does
from
that work?
Afghanistan.
How does that work happen from this point on? Is what I wanted to leave and ask you as a final question. So now that the Taliban is in the works of setting up its government in Afghanistan, we don't know what engagement it will choose to do with other countries and other powers. It is tethered right now to Pakistan. It has now been receptive to uh, an outreach from China, which wasn't there 25 years ago when the Taliban were earlier in power. Uh, how does the United States, India make sure that they ring fence and contain any possible refostering of activity that threatens their security?
Well, I think there are two, three elements of this. One would be to strengthen intelligence cooperation on a real time basis, which can help you to ward off terrorist incidents. And I think that's the best way of handling it for India to harden its borders, to strengthen its security, and to strengthen intelligence cooperation with key partners, including the US. The second would be for the US to help build India's counterterrorism capabilities, particularly in technology. And that is an ongoing process, which we both actually, intelligence sharing and technology upgradation, are ongoing processes. And I don't see those being disrupted. In fact, I see the logic of the situation taking these further. And the third element would be to continue diplomatic pressure on Pakistan and the new Taliban government, and that the US is seeking to do, working in coordination with international partners. So neither Russia nor China. And if Russia and China don't recognize Taliban, I don't think Pakistan would be in a position to do so by itself. So you can see that the global effort is to hold the Taliban to some of their commitments, including with regard to women's education, women's rights, minority rights, and having a more inclusive government, because right now it just looks like the same old Taliban government which was there. But the way the situation on the ground is going, and the ability of top leaders to rein in their ground forces, because these are, combat troops, and there were no hard and fast chains of command, many commanders operating at their own initiative. I think this is going to be a somewhat turbulent period for Afghanistan itself. And the sooner they are able to realize that they are in an international community, and if they want to and need to engage with that international community, which they clearly do because they need financing, then they have to also moderate the policies that they have followed so far.
All right. On that note, Ambassador Meera Shankar, thank you very much for making time to help us understand the events of the last month and a half, the policy priorities going into these meetings that occurred through last week, and looking forward to how some of this will operationally work out. If you have been watching, thank you.
Thank you.